Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. Before the cross, the spiritual world of the pagan Vikings. You are standing in a cold northern landscape, long before church bells ever rang across it. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and salt water. Around you are longhouses with turf-covered roofs, farms pressed tightly against forests, and narrow paths leading toward the sea. This is Scandinavia before Christianity, a world where belief is not confined to buildings or written doctrine, but woven into daily survival. The Vikings did not think of religion as a separate part of life. It was not something reserved for special days. It existed everywhere, in the weather, in the soil, in the success of a voyage, and in the health of livestock. When you rise in the morning in this world, you do not ask whether the gods exist. You assume they do because the world itself feels crowded with unseen forces. The gods of the Norse are not distant creators watching from the sky. They walk, argue, fail, and even die. Odin is wise but deceptive. Thor is powerful but impulsive. Freya governs fertility and peace, and countless other beings, giants, elves, land spirits, and the restless dead, inhabit the same space as humans. This belief system does not promise moral perfection or eternal peace. Instead, it reflects a harsh environment where strength, honor, and adaptability matter more than obedience. There is no single holy book. Knowledge passes through stories spoken aloud during long winter nights. These stories change slightly with each telling, shaped by the memory of the speaker and the needs of the listener. You learn the myths not as doctrine, but as practical wisdom. Odin sacrifices an eye for knowledge, reminding you that wisdom demands cost. Thor protects humanity, but even he cannot stop the final destruction of the world. The lesson is subtle but constant. Nothing lasts forever, not even the gods. Religious practice is equally flexible. There are no priests in the later Christian sense. Instead, ritual authority belongs to household heads, local chieftains, and specialists like seeresses, known as verlur, who travel between communities. A verlva does not preach. She performs rituals, chants, and prophecies, often entering trance-like states. When she speaks, people listen carefully, not because she claims divine law, but because experience has taught them that ignoring spiritual signs can be dangerous. You might participate in a blot, a sacrificial feast meant to maintain balance between humans and the gods. These events are not daily occurrences, but they are regular and deeply communal. Animals, sometimes horses, cattle, or pigs, are sacrificed, their blood sprinkled on altars, walls, and people. The meat is then cooked and eaten together. This is not an act of cruelty for its own sake. It is a transaction, a gift given with the expectation of return. Good harvests, calm seas, healthy children. Daily life reinforces belief in subtle ways. Before a journey, you may carve protective symbols on your ship. When illness strikes, you might blame offended spirits or disrupted balance rather than random chance. Burial customs reflect a belief that the dead continue to exist in some form. Grave goods, tools, weapons, jewelry are placed carefully beside bodies, suggesting that life does not simply end, but changes location. Death itself is not presented as equal for everyone. Warriors hope for Valhalla or Folkvanger, halls of the slain where combat continues endlessly. But most people do not expect glorious afterlives. Instead, they anticipate a quieter existence in burial mounds or ancestral realms. This reflects reality. Most Vikings are farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, and traders. Raiding exists, but it is not the center of daily life. Survival depends on cooperation, seasonal labor, and respect for tradition. The gods are tied closely to place. Sacred groves, springs, stones, and hills carry spiritual meaning. These locations are not marked by monumental architecture. They are known through memory. You are told as a child which grove must not be cut, which stone must not be moved. Disrespecting these places risks misfortune, and misfortune in a fragile environment can mean death. Importantly, Norse religion does not demand exclusivity. New gods can be acknowledged without abandoning old ones. When Vikings travel to the British Isles, to Francia, to the east along river routes, they encounter Christian symbols and saints. Some bring back crosses, not as signs of conversion, but as additional sources of protection. A God that works is a God worth honoring. This openness is one reason Christianity will later struggle and succeed at the same time. The Vikings do not immediately reject the Christian God. They simply see him as one power among many. Missionaries often misunderstand this. When a Viking agrees to baptism but continues honoring Thor, it feels like betrayal to Christians. To the Viking, it feels practical. The lack of centralized religious authority means belief varies widely. What is sacred in one region may be less important in another. Coastal communities emphasize gods associated with sea travel and trade. Inland farmers focus more on fertility and land spirits. This diversity makes the religion resilient but also vulnerable. Without fixed doctrine, belief adapts, but it can also slowly dissolve when conditions change. As political power grows more centralized in the late Viking Age, kings begin to look beyond tradition. They notice that Christian rulers to the south rule through written law, administrative systems, and alliances reinforced by shared faith. Pagan belief has never needed bureaucracy, but kingdoms do. At this early stage, though, none of that feels inevitable. You live in a world that has always existed this way, where the old gods are woven into memory, landscape, and routine. Christianity is still a rumor carried by traders and captives, a distant idea from lands where winters are shorter and power looks different. And so the question quietly forms beneath the surface of everyday life. In a world already full of gods, spirits, and rituals that seem to work well enough, what would ever persuade people like you to abandon them? If you stay in this pre-Christian Viking world a little longer, something becomes clear. Belief is less about conviction and more about habit. Religion is not argued over in abstract terms. It is practiced quietly, repeatedly, almost automatically. You do not wake up wondering which God is true. You wake up wondering whether the winter will be long, whether the soil will thaw in time, whether your sheep will survive. The gods exist because they have always existed alongside these concerns. Much of pagan belief is embedded in routine actions so ordinary they barely feel religious. When you pour the first drink of the evening onto the ground, it is not a dramatic offering, just a gesture of respect. When you speak certain words before setting sail, you are not praying in the later Christian sense. You are acknowledging forces you cannot control. These habits accumulate over a lifetime, reinforcing belief without ever demanding conscious loyalty. Children learn religion the same way they learn work. There are no lessons set aside for theology. Instead, stories are told while repairing nets, carving wood, or spinning wool. You hear about Odin not as a distant god, but as a wanderer who tests hospitality, an idea that reinforces the importance of welcoming strangers. You hear about Loki's betrayals and punishments, which quietly warn against unchecked cleverness and broken trust. These myths are moral, but loosely so. They offer examples rather than rules. Seasonal festivals structure the year. Winter nights are marked by Yule, a time of feasting meant to ensure the sun's return. Spring brings rituals connected to fertility and growth. These are not optional celebrations. They align communities with the rhythms of nature, which are unforgiving if ignored. To abandon these traditions would feel less like a spiritual shift and more like a reckless gamble with survival. Social structure reinforces belief as well. Chieftains often serve as ritual leaders, hosting feasts and overseeing sacrifices. Their authority is partly political, partly spiritual. If a chieftain prospers, his gods are seen as favorable. If he fails repeatedly, bad harvests, lost battles, his legitimacy weakens. Religion and leadership are inseparable, and loyalty to one supports loyalty to the other. This creates a practical worldview. The gods are powerful but not absolute. They can be bargained with, even blamed. If a harvest fails, it may mean the ritual was performed incorrectly or the wrong god was honored. This encourages adjustment rather than doubt. You do not stop believing, you change your approach. Death further reinforces this mindset. Without a single, universal afterlife, people focus more on memory than salvation. How you are remembered matters more than where your soul goes. This encourages generosity, hospitality, and visible acts of honor. Reputation survives when bodies do not. Christianity's later promise of eternal judgment will clash sharply with this emphasis on communal memory. Yet even in this seemingly stable system, small cracks appear over time. Trade expands. Vikings travel farther and stay longer in Christian lands. Some settle permanently. They marry locals, adopt foreign customs, and bring new ideas home. Coins stamped with crosses circulate alongside silver weighed by hand. Written contracts appear, quietly changing how trust works. Slavery plays an uncomfortable role here as well. Captives taken from Christian regions sometimes maintain their faith in private. They sing unfamiliar songs, refuse certain foods, or make the sign of the cross in moments of fear. These acts are noticed, sometimes mocked, sometimes tolerated. Over time, familiarity softens suspicion. Christianity stops being entirely foreign. Practical advantages become visible too. Christian merchants often have access to wider trade networks. Christian rulers offer alliances more readily to those who share their faith. Kings who convert may gain recognition, legitimacy, and support beyond their borders. None of this requires belief in Christian theology, only recognition of political reality. Still, for ordinary people, the old gods continue to feel reliable. They are local, personal, and embedded in daily labor. Christianity, by contrast, arrives with demands: exclusive worship, rejection of old rituals, new moral codes. It speaks of humility in cultures that prize honor, of forgiveness in societies built on feud and compensation. This tension creates a long period of overlap rather than immediate replacement. Crosses appear beside Thor's hammers. Christian prayers are added to old rituals rather than replacing them. Some families hedge their bets, honoring both systems quietly. To later historians, this looks like confusion. To those living it, it looks like caution. Over generations, however, habits begin to shift. Children raised with baptism grow accustomed to churches. Burial practices change slowly, first mixing grave goods with Christian symbols, then abandoning them entirely. Sacred groves are cut down not out of hatred, but because new fields are needed and old taboos feel less urgent. What weakens the old religion most is not argument, but redundancy. When storms still come despite sacrifices, when Christian neighbors prosper without blot, when kings enforce new laws backed by written authority, the old ways begin to feel less necessary. Not false, just optional. And so, without a single moment of collapse, the spiritual world of the Vikings starts to thin. Gods who once filled forests and fields retreat into stories. Rituals become traditions rather than necessities. What was once instinctive slowly becomes remembered. As this quiet transformation continues, another question emerges, less dramatic but more decisive. When belief fades not through defeat but through neglect, is it truly lost or merely waiting to return in another form? By the time the old gods begin to disappear from daily life, there is no single moment you can point to and say, this is when it ended. That, more than anything, defines the conversion of the Viking world. It is not a sudden collapse of belief, but a gradual thinning, like mist lifting from the ground as the sun rises. When you look back later, the landscape is clearly changed, but while it is happening, each step feels small, reasonable, and easy to justify. For many people, the change begins with authority rather than faith. Kings and powerful chieftains adopt Christianity first, often for political reasons. When they do, the religion of the household follows. If your lord is baptized, his feasts change. Christian prayers open gatherings where pagan invocations once stood. Attendance is expected, not debated. Belief remains private, but practice becomes public. This matters because Norse religion has always been communal. Rituals are shared events. When participation fades, the religion loses its living rhythm. A blot performed by one family alone feels hollow. A sacred grove avoided by only a few becomes just a forest again. Christianity does not need everyone to believe deeply at once, it only needs consistent, visible participation. The landscape itself begins to change. Wooden churches rise in places once marked only by memory. Unlike sacred groves, churches are difficult to ignore. They dominate space, casting shadows, ringing bells, drawing attention. They fix belief to a location that does not move with tradition or storytelling. Stone replaces wood. Permanence replaces flexibility. Burial customs offer one of the clearest signs of transition. Graves grow simpler, goods disappear, bodies are aligned carefully facing east. This change reflects a shift in how people imagine death. The dead no longer remain close, inhabiting mounds and memory. They move elsewhere beyond reach, beyond negotiation. For some, this is comforting. For others, it feels like loss. The old gods do not vanish completely. They retreat into language, place names, and stories told without ritual weight. Thor becomes a figure of legend rather than protection. Odin becomes a symbol of wisdom rather than a god who might intervene. Children hear the stories but do not perform the sacrifices. Memory survives where practice does not. Christianity fills the space differently. It offers written law, unified authority, and a moral framework that extends beyond kin and region. Feuds slowly give way to fines and courts. Kings rule not just through strength, but through divine approval recognized across borders. The Viking world becomes part of medieval Europe, not by conquest but by alignment. What is lost is subtle. The sense that the land itself is alive, watching, responsive. The expectation that spirits inhabit every stream and stone. What is gained is equally profound. Stability, connection, a shared system that links the North to a wider world. From a distance, historians speak of conversion as a success or failure, as progress or destruction. Living through it, you would likely feel none of that. You would feel adjustment, new routines, old habits fading without ceremony. The gods do not die in battle, they fall silent when no one speaks to them anymore. Yet even silence leaves echoes. The old beliefs shape art, law, and identity long after formal worship ends. They influence how stories are told, how courage is admired, how nature is respected. Christianity overlays the old world, but it does not erase it entirely. And so, as the Viking world crosses into a new spiritual age, you are left with a final, quiet reflection. When a belief system shaped by survival and landscape fades into memory, does it truly end, or does it simply change its voice, waiting to be heard in different ways by future generations? Story 2. The first missionary strangers from the South. You first notice them not by what they say, but by how they move. They dress differently, speak with unfamiliar rhythms, and carry objects that do not seem immediately useful: books, small wooden crosses, vessels for ritual rather than trade. In a world where nearly everything is judged by practical value, these strangers stand out before they ever open their mouths. The first Christian missionaries to enter the Viking world do not arrive as conquerors. They come quietly, often alone or in very small groups, traveling the same rivers and sea routes used by merchants and raiders. Some come willingly, driven by faith. Others arrive as former captives who return north with beliefs learned in foreign lands. A few are sent deliberately by Christian rulers, hoping to extend influence without armies. From your perspective, these missionaries are odd but not immediately threatening. Foreigners are common in trading towns like Hedeby, Ribe, Burka, and Kopang. You are used to hearing different languages and seeing unfamiliar customs. At first, Christianity appears to be just another southern tradition, no more intrusive than new coin designs or unfamiliar weights. The missionaries, however, carry assumptions that do not align with the world they enter. They believe truth is singular. They believe belief must be exclusive. They believe their God demands abandonment of all others. These ideas are not obvious at first. Early conversations are cautious, even polite. A missionary may speak of one God among many, emphasizing power and protection rather than doctrine. This is intentional. They are adapting, translating their message into concepts that make sense locally. But even softened, the message is strange. The Christian God does not live in the landscape. He does not inhabit specific groves or stones. He does not require blood sacrifices. He cannot be bargained with in the old way. Instead, he demands loyalty, obedience, and belief in events that happened far away, long ago, written down in texts you cannot read. Books themselves are objects of fascination. In a largely oral culture, writing feels like a kind of magic. Missionaries read silently, consult pages, and claim authority from words fixed in place. This unsettles some listeners. Knowledge in your world is fluid, adaptable. Written words cannot argue back. They cannot adjust to circumstance. Yet they endure unchanged, which gives them a different kind of power. Early missionary efforts are fragile. Many fail quietly. A preacher speaks, gathers a small audience, is politely listened to, and then ignored. Others face open hostility, especially when they condemn local practices too harshly. There are stories, some exaggerated, some true, of missionaries killed, driven out, or humiliated. These incidents later become martyr tales in Christian records, but locally they are seen as predictable outcomes of disrespect. The missionaries who survive longest are those who observe before speaking. They learn customs, accept hospitality, and avoid direct confrontation with established rituals. Some serve as advisors to chieftains, offering literacy, diplomatic connections, or access to Christian courts abroad. Conversion, when it happens, often begins at the top. Kings and powerful leaders are practical. They recognize that Christian missionaries bring more than faith. They bring alliances, legitimacy, and a place in a wider political network. When a king allows a missionary to stay, it is often less about belief and more about opportunity. For ordinary people, interaction with missionaries is limited but memorable. You might hear a sermon translated poorly into your language, full of unfamiliar concepts like original sin or eternal judgment. These ideas do not fit neatly into your worldview. Sin, in your culture, is a matter of social consequence, not cosmic offense. Judgment comes from the community, not a distant God. Still, some aspects resonate. The idea of forgiveness appeals in societies tired of endless feuds. The promise that all people, not just warriors or elites, matter equally before God is quietly radical. Slaves, women, and the poor sometimes listen most closely, though their interest is rarely recorded in surviving sources. Daily coexistence creates slow familiarity. A missionary blesses a meal. A Christian trader refuses certain sacrifices. A baptized captive teaches a child a prayer. None of this demands immediate change, but it accumulates. Christianity stops being an abstraction and becomes a lived presence, however small. Yet tension remains beneath the surface. The missionaries insist on exclusivity even when they soften their tone. They cannot accept compromise forever. At some point, Thor must be rejected. Sacrifices must stop. Old sacred places must lose their meaning. These demands, though postponed, hang in the air. For now, the missionaries wait. They preach, observe, and endure. They rely on patience rather than force, aware that belief imposed too quickly will not last. They are strangers in a world that does not yet need them, but history is beginning to bend in their direction. And so, as these quiet figures settle into trading towns and royal courts, a question slowly takes shape. When belief arrives not with armies but with words, alliances, and time, how long does it take before listening turns into obedience? As time passes, the missionaries learn what survival in the North requires. Zeal alone is not enough. Loud condemnation fails quickly. Those who endure are the ones who adapt, who learn when to speak, and more importantly, when to remain silent. You begin to see them less as intruders and more as fixtures at the edges of society, quietly persistent, rarely comfortable but increasingly familiar. They settle where movement and exchange already exist. Trading towns become their footholds. In places like Burka or Hedeby, no single tradition dominates completely. Goods, languages, and customs circulate constantly. Here, Christianity can exist without immediately threatening older beliefs. A small chapel may stand near the harbor, used by foreign merchants and a handful of locals who have accepted baptism for practical reasons. It is not impressive, but it is visible. Missionaries spend much of their time not preaching but explaining. They answer questions slowly, often repeatedly. Why does your God forbid sacrifices? Why does he care what people eat or whom they marry? Why does he allow suffering? These questions do not come from philosophical curiosity alone. They are practical concerns in a world where survival depends on action, not abstract belief. The missionaries struggle most with exclusivity. When someone agrees to baptism but continues honoring the old gods, the missionary sees failure. The convert sees insurance. This difference creates frustration on both sides. Written Christian sources complain endlessly about backsliding, half-conversions, and pagan stubbornness. What they describe is not resistance so much as a different understanding of what belief means. Power quietly reshapes the conversation. When a chieftain shows interest in Christianity, the tone changes immediately. Missionaries focus their attention upward, knowing that households follow leadership. A king who converts brings not just his family, but his court, his warriors, and eventually his laws. Conversion becomes contagious, but not necessarily heartfelt. Some rulers test Christianity cautiously. They allow churches to be built but do not destroy old shrines. They accept baptism but delay enforcing Christian law. This balancing act keeps peace in the short term but creates confusion. Is Christianity optional or inevitable? No one knows yet. Violence occasionally erupts, but it is inconsistent. Some missionaries are protected fiercely by kings who value their foreign connections. Others are expelled or killed when they offend local sensibilities. These moments are remembered differently depending on who tells the story. Christians record martyrdom. Locals remember disorder. Daily life continues much as before. Fields are planted. Ships sail. Feasts are held. Christianity weaves itself into routine subtly. A prayer here, a new burial custom there. The missionaries understand that time is their greatest ally. Every child baptized is one less person raised fully within the old system. Yet tension never disappears. The missionaries' refusal to compromise fully creates unease. They preach peace but align themselves with kings. They condemn violence but benefit from power enforced by swords. People notice these contradictions, even if they do not articulate them. By the late stages of this coexistence, Christianity is no longer strange, but it is not yet dominant. It exists everywhere and nowhere at once. You cannot ignore it, but you do not have to fully accept it either. It lingers, waiting for the moment when patience gives way to decision. And that moment is approaching, carried not by missionaries, but by rulers who see faith not only as belief, but as a tool for order and control. When power finally chooses certainty over balance, the space for coexistence begins to shrink. So the question becomes unavoidable. When tolerance has served its purpose and authority demands clarity, will faith still arrive by persuasion, or will it finally be enforced? The final stage of the missionaries' work does not feel like a victory march. There are no mass conversions sparked by a single sermon, no dramatic moments where entire regions abandon their old gods at once. Instead, Christianity becomes ordinary, and in becoming ordinary, it becomes powerful. You begin to notice that the missionaries are no longer visitors. They have names everyone recognizes. They own land granted by kings. They speak the local language fluently. Some are no longer foreigners at all, but men born in the north, educated abroad, and returned with authority that feels both familiar and distant. The faith they represent is no longer an import, it has roots. Churches multiply slowly, often built near existing centers of power. A church near a royal hall sends a clear message without violence. It says that this faith belongs to authority now. Attendance may still be uneven, but absence is noticed. What was once optional becomes expected. The role of missionaries shifts. They stop adapting their message so carefully. Exclusivity becomes firmer. Pagan rituals are no longer merely discouraged, they are condemned. Sacrifices are labeled sinful rather than misguided. Sacred groves are cut down not out of necessity, but deliberately to demonstrate that the old gods no longer protect their places. For many people, this is unsettling, but not surprising. Change has been moving in this direction for generations. The old religion has already weakened through neglect. Christianity does not destroy a vibrant system so much as replace one that has slowly lost its grip on daily life. Resistance still occurs. Some communities cling to old practices in private. Others revolt briefly, especially when Christian law interferes with traditional customs around marriage, inheritance, or feud. These moments are usually crushed quickly. Kings now have written law, clerical support, and international backing. The balance of power has shifted decisively. What remains of the missionaries' original mission is almost unrecognizable. They are no longer strangers pleading for acceptance. They are administrators, judges, and teachers. Their faith is enforced through routine rather than argument. Children grow up knowing church calendars better than seasonal sacrifices. Memory replaces practice. Looking back, it becomes clear that the missionaries succeeded not because they convinced everyone, but because they endured. They outlasted the old rhythms. They aligned themselves with emerging power structures. They waited until belief became habit, and habit became law. The Viking world does not become Christian overnight, but by the time anyone notices the absence of the old gods, it is already too late to bring them back. They survive in stories, symbols, and quiet nostalgia, but no longer shape decisions. And so the strangers from the south become part of the landscape, their faith no longer questioned, their presence unremarkable. The world moves on, carrying echoes of what came before. As you step forward into the next chapter of this history, one question lingers. If faith can spread so completely without conquest, what happens when rulers decide that belief itself is a weapon? Story 3. Kings, Baptisms, and Political Faith. You first notice the change not in temples or churches, but in halls of power. The language of belief begins to appear in places where decisions are made, disputes settled, and loyalty measured. Christianity, once carried by wandering missionaries and foreign traders, now speaks with the voice of kings. For a ruler in the late Viking age, faith is no longer just a personal matter. It is strategy. You rule over scattered farms, ambitious chieftains, and families bound more tightly to kin than crown. Power is negotiated constantly. Every feast, gift, and alliance matters. In this environment, Christianity offers something new, a way to centralize authority beyond personal reputation and military strength. A pagan king rules by consensus and force. He must continually prove himself. A Christian king rules, at least in theory, by divine right. His authority is sanctioned by a God recognized far beyond his borders. This difference is subtle but transformative. It turns leadership from a performance into an institution. Baptism becomes a political act. When a king is baptized, it is often done publicly, witnessed by rivals and allies alike. The ceremony sends a message. This ruler is aligning with a wider world. He is no longer just a local strongman, but part of a Christian order that stretches across Europe. You do not need to believe deeply to recognize the advantage. Christian rulers can marry into powerful dynasties. They can negotiate with emperors and popes. They can import clergy who bring literacy, administration, and record-keeping. Written law replaces memory. Taxes become predictable. Succession becomes more stable, at least in theory. Some kings convert sincerely. Others do so reluctantly or opportunistically. The distinction matters less than the outcome. Once a ruler converts, he is expected to enforce the new faith. Neutrality is no longer an option. A Christian king who tolerates paganism risks appearing weak, both to his subjects and to foreign allies. This creates tension at every level of society. You may live far from the royal court, tending fields much as your ancestors did, yet decisions made in distant halls now affect your rituals, marriages, and burials. The king's faith becomes law, whether or not it matches your habits. Conversion from above does not erase old beliefs immediately. Instead, it reframes them as rebellion. What was once tradition becomes resistance. A sacrifice is no longer a communal act, it is defiance. This change in meaning is powerful. It turns private practice into public risk. Kings often proceed carefully at first. They outlaw sacrifices in name but enforce the ban unevenly. They build churches near royal centers, allowing the countryside to adjust slowly. This gradual approach avoids revolt, but it also spreads uncertainty. No one knows exactly how far the new rules extend. Royal support changes the role of the church. Clergy are no longer guests, they are officials. They advise kings, draft laws, and legitimize authority. In return, they receive protection and land. Faith and power intertwine so closely that separating them becomes impossible. From your perspective, this feels less like spiritual awakening and more like administrative change. The calendar shifts, new holidays appear, old ones fade quietly. The king's justice replaces local vengeance. Christianity becomes the language of order. Yet beneath the surface, belief remains uneven. Some accept the new faith willingly. Others comply outwardly while clinging to old customs in private. The king may rule bodies, but hearts are harder to command. As royal baptisms multiply across Scandinavia, a pattern emerges. Christianity spreads fastest where kings are strongest. Where power is fragmented, resistance lasts longer. Faith follows authority, not the other way around. And so, as more rulers step into baptismal waters, another question presses forward. When a king's belief becomes law, what happens to those who refuse not just in faith, but in identity itself? Once a king has been baptized, belief can no longer remain vague. Christianity demands clarity, and kings who adopt it are expected to demonstrate commitment not only in word, but in action. For you, living under this changing authority, the shift is gradual but unmistakable. The rules governing daily life begin to change, and they change unevenly, depending on how closely the king's power reaches into your region. At first, enforcement is symbolic. Pagan temples and shrines near royal centers are dismantled or repurposed. A church might be built on the same ground, not always to erase memory, but to claim continuity of authority. These acts send a message without requiring confrontation in distant rural areas. They signal intention more than completion. Laws follow. Sacrifice, once a communal obligation, is redefined as a crime, but punishment varies. In some areas, fines replace ritual obligations. In others, offenders face exile or loss of status. Rarely is violence the first response. Kings understand that faith imposed too harshly will provoke rebellion. You begin to notice the presence of new officials, bishops, priests, royal agents traveling between communities. They collect tithes, record marriages, oversee baptisms, and enforce Christian burial practices. Their authority does not come from local reputation, but from royal and ecclesiastical backing. This makes them resented but difficult to ignore. Loyalty becomes tangled with faith. A refusal to convert may be interpreted as defiance of the crown. This is especially dangerous in times of political instability, when rivals look for any excuse to challenge authority. Christianity provides a convenient dividing line. Supporters of the king are faithful, opponents are backward or rebellious. Some communities adapt quickly. They accept baptism, attend church, and abandon public sacrifices. Others comply outwardly while quietly preserving old customs at home. Amulets are hidden under clothing. Old stories are told as entertainment rather than belief. This dual existence allows survival without open conflict. Kings are not blind to this. Many tolerate private belief for a time, focusing instead on visible conformity. What matters is order, not inner conviction. Over generations, habit does what force cannot. Children raised under Christian law accept it as normal, even if their grandparents did not. Resistance still flares. In regions where royal authority is weak, old beliefs become symbols of independence. Shrines are defended, priests are driven out. These revolts are rarely successful. Kings now command standing forces, written law, and external allies. Rebellion is costly and increasingly futile. The personal cost of conversion varies. Some lose roles as ritual leaders. Others gain new status within the church. Social hierarchies shift. Knowledge of Latin and literacy become paths to power. The old skills memory, storytelling, ritual expertise lose value in a written world. For you, the change feels less like betrayal and more like adaptation. You do what is required to survive. Faith becomes something practiced publicly and remembered privately. Over time, even memory fades. By the middle of this process, Christianity no longer needs justification. It is embedded in law, education, and governance. To question it is to question order itself. Yet the system remains fragile. Kings still face rivals. Alliances shift. A ruler's death can reopen old conflicts. Conversion imposed from above must be maintained constantly or risk unraveling. And so the tension remains unresolved. Can a faith rooted in authority endure when authority itself is unstable, or will belief falter when kings fall? When a Christian king dies, his faith does not automatically die with him, but neither is it guaranteed to survive unchanged. Succession has always been dangerous in the Viking world. Now, belief is tied to that danger. Each new ruler must reaffirm not only his right to rule, but his commitment to the faith that legitimizes him. Some heirs are raised Christian and rule without hesitation. Others inherit a kingdom where conversion is recent and fragile. In these moments, uncertainty returns. Old practices resurface quietly. Laws are ignored. Churches stand empty. The success of Christianity depends not on its truth, but on its continuity through power. Kings learn quickly that belief must be maintained through routine rather than force. Laws are standardized. Churches are funded. Clergy are trained locally rather than imported. Christianity becomes institutional, less dependent on individual rulers. This is the moment when faith finally detaches from the personality of kings and settles into structure. For ordinary people, this transition is subtle. You notice fewer changes because the changes have already become normal. Baptism is expected at birth. Marriage is regulated. Burial follows Christian custom without question. The old world feels distant, half-remembered. Yet traces remain. Seasonal rhythms echo older festivals. Local saints absorb characteristics of former gods. Stories persist, stripped of sacred weight but heavy with cultural memory. Christianity adapts, absorbs, and reshapes what came before rather than erasing it completely. In time, even resistance becomes legend. The violence and coercion of conversion fade from memory, replaced by stories of inevitable progress. The past is smoothed, made less uncomfortable. History becomes narrative rather than experience. Looking back, it becomes clear that kings did not simply convert their people, they changed the meaning of belief itself. Faith shifted from lived relationship with a landscape to allegiance within a system. This transformation allowed kingdoms to grow, but at the cost of intimacy with the world around them. And so the Viking Age ends not with a final battle, but with paperwork, ritual, and habit. The cross replaces the hammer not through conquest, but through administration. As the North settles into its new identity, one final question lingers from this story. When belief is shaped by power for long enough, can it ever return to something chosen freely, or does it always carry the shadow of the crown? Story 4. Iceland's Quiet Compromise. You arrive in Iceland at the far edge of the Viking world, where nothing feels settled for very long. The land itself is young and unstable volcano steam, lava fields crack underfoot, and thin soil clings stubbornly to rock. There are no ancient kings here, no long-established dynasties, no sacred groves worn smooth by centuries of ritual. Everything feels provisional, as if society itself is an experiment still underway. This matters deeply for how Christianity will arrive. Iceland is settled late, mostly in the late 9th century, by people already shaped by movement and choice. Many of the families who come here are not seeking conquest or glory. They are leaving something behind: political pressure in Norway, feuds that have grown too costly, kings whose authority feels increasingly intrusive. Iceland offers distance. Not safety exactly, but freedom from centralized power. From the beginning, Iceland has no king. Authority is distributed among chieftains, and law is negotiated publicly at the Althing, an annual assembly where disputes are settled, marriages arranged, and laws spoken aloud. This system depends on consensus. Violence exists, but it is constrained by reputation and legal consequence. No single person can simply impose belief by force. Religiously, early Iceland looks much like pagan Scandinavia, but thinner, lighter, less rooted. There are no monumental temples. Rituals are held in homes or small local spaces. Belief travels with people rather than land. This makes it resilient in one way, but also vulnerable. Without deep sacred geography, faith rests more on habit than place. Christianity arrives in Iceland early, carried by the same currents as elsewhere: trade, travel, kinship. Some settlers are already familiar with Christian ideas. A few are baptized abroad. Others have Christian spouses or slaves. From the start, Iceland is religiously mixed, though pagan practice dominates. At first, this causes little trouble. The Icelandic system is used to disagreement. Chieftains tolerate variation as long as it does not disrupt order. A Christian may refuse to participate in sacrifices. A pagan may ignore Christian fasts. As long as law and honor are maintained, belief remains personal. Missionaries do come, but they are cautious. They understand quickly that Iceland cannot be converted from the top down. There is no king to persuade. Every chieftain matters, and every household has a voice. Open confrontation would fracture the fragile social balance. Daily life reinforces moderation. Survival in Iceland is hard. Farming is marginal. Winters are brutal. Cooperation matters more than ideology. A feud sparked by religion could destroy entire families. This reality tempers zeal on both sides. Still, tension grows slowly. As Norway becomes more firmly Christian, pressure increases. Norwegian kings begin to expect conformity from Icelandic traders. Access to timber, iron, and markets depends increasingly on good relations. Faith becomes entangled with survival once again, but this time indirectly. Within Iceland, divisions sharpen. Some chieftains convert and encourage their followers to do the same. Others remain pagan, seeing conversion as submission to foreign influence. Christianity begins to symbolize alignment either with the wider Christian world or with Iceland's older independence. By the late 10th century, coexistence becomes strained. Private belief is no longer the issue, public practice is. Can sacrifices continue openly? Can Christian law coexist with pagan custom? The Althing begins to feel the weight of a decision it has postponed for decades. Unlike other regions, Iceland has no army to enforce an outcome. Whatever happens must be agreed upon, or the society risks collapse. The question is no longer which god is stronger, but whether the community itself can survive division. And so, as Iceland approaches a moment unlike any other in the Viking world, you are left with a uniquely quiet but dangerous uncertainty. When belief threatens unity in a society built on compromise, how much can be surrendered to preserve peace? Iceland's conversion story is remarkable not for grand battles or dramatic crusades, but for negotiation, compromise, and quiet pragmatism. You live in a society where belief is communal, but coercion is nearly impossible. There is no king to enforce law by sword. There is only the all-thing, where words carry as much weight as weapons, and the balance of honor and survival keeps society intact. By the late 10th century, Christian influence has grown steadily. Missionaries have arrived from Norway and beyond, carrying crosses, books, and Latin prayers. Some Icelanders have spent time abroad and returned baptized, bringing personal conviction with them. Others have observed Christian neighbors, traders, or rulers and seen advantages in participation. Still, a significant portion of the population maintains pagan traditions, practicing sacrifices quietly or openly, depending on local tolerance. The tension comes to a head in the 999-1000. Feuds, legal disputes, and economic pressures highlight a central question. Can Iceland remain unified if its population is divided by faith? Pagan chieftains insist on retaining sacred rituals, fearing the loss of their ancestors' protection. Christian leaders urge conformity, warning that misfortune or foreign scrutiny could follow divided loyalties. Both sides understand the stakes. The society itself hangs in the balance. The solution is unprecedented: compromise through law. The All-Thing, acting as a representative assembly, debates the matter not in theology but in practicality. Their focus is survival, not spiritual purity. They make a choice that seems odd to distant observers: allow Christianity to be practiced openly, but preserve certain pagan practices temporarily, provided they do not disrupt public order. Sacrifices are restricted to private locations, and certain festivals are adjusted rather than abolished. In effect, the All-Thing chooses tolerance enforced by law. Bishoprics are not yet established, but Christian leaders are granted recognition. Churches can be built, Christian law may be observed in legal matters, and baptism becomes common. Yet for years, pagan beliefs continue alongside Christian practice in households across the island. This dual system persists not because the old gods are powerful, but because Icelanders are practical. Survival depends on compromise more than dogma. The conversion of Iceland demonstrates that faith can be negotiated. It is not imposed by power but facilitated through dialogue and law. Kings, armies, and written decrees exist elsewhere in Scandinavia. In Iceland, consensus rules. For you observing this world, it is striking how little spectacle is involved. No battles are fought for souls. No clergy wield swords. Belief changes because society demands it, not because one side overwhelms the other. Yet compromise has limits. Over decades, the balance shifts slowly. Young Icelanders are baptized by default, educated in Christian practices, and marry under Christian law. Even pagan chieftains gradually adopt Christian norms, often blending them with older traditions in private. The old gods retreat into memory, ritual becomes symbolic, and Christianity becomes the public norm. But the quiet compromise leaves traces. Stories, place names, and certain seasonal customs persist as reminders of the old world. This process shapes Icelandic identity differently than in Norway, Denmark, or Sweden. Faith here is embedded in negotiation, not conquest. Authority is exercised through law and consensus, not divine right or royal power. Christianity succeeds, but without erasing the culture that gave it meaning. The island demonstrates that religion can spread without force, yet still require delicate handling to preserve social cohesion. By the end of this period, you notice a remarkable pattern. What survives from pagan Iceland is memory, story, and cultural habit, not the practical rituals themselves. Christianity dominates the visible landscape, yet it carries echoes of compromise and negotiation that influence governance and identity for centuries to come. And so the quiet question persists. When faith succeeds through compromise rather than coercion, Does it ever feel complete, or does it carry the shadow of what was intentionally preserved? By the early 11th century, Iceland has settled into a uniquely peaceful arrangement. Christianity has become the public norm. Churches appear in towns and settlements. The Althing records decisions according to Christian law, and most Icelanders are baptized, married, and buried under Christian ritual. Yet beneath this, traces of the old world remain. They are subtle, a festival remembered but no longer fully observed, a story told around the fire, a hill once considered sacred now visited with quiet reverence rather than ceremony. The genius of Iceland's conversion is not in dramatic force, but in timing and negotiation. The Althing has enforced Christianity without creating open rebellion. Communities retain internal cohesion while outwardly embracing the new faith. Unlike in Norway or Denmark, where kings and missionaries imposed order through authority, Iceland relies on social consensus. The result is a model of conversion that is voluntary in form, if subtly compelled by law, economics, and survival. Chieftains, too, adjust. Some, baptized by necessity, quietly maintain older traditions at home. Others adopt Christian norms publicly and privately. The blend of old and new creates a continuity rather than rupture. The society does not feel conquered by faith. It feels transformed by necessity and pragmatism. For Icelanders, Christianity is less about rejecting the old gods and more about integrating new tools for social stability. The impact on daily life is profound. Legal systems are more predictable, and disputes are increasingly resolved according to codified Christian laws rather than through ritual obligations or vendettas. Feasts and assemblies acquire new meaning, structured by church calendars and Christian saints' days. Education and literacy spread through clerical influence, giving Icelanders access to broader European knowledge networks. The island becomes connected to a world far beyond its shores, while maintaining its unique political and cultural character. Yet memory endures. Stories of Thor and Odin are preserved in sagas, written centuries later, reflecting both nostalgia and moral insight. Certain practices, seasonal customs, superstitions, and charms linger quietly in households. Christianity succeeds not by erasing the past entirely, but by reshaping it. In Iceland, faith is a framework layered on top of a pre-existing culture rather than a replacement. From your perspective, the lesson is subtle but clear. Religion is not always imposed by force, nor is it always embraced immediately. It can succeed through negotiation, compromise, and alignment with societal needs. Iceland's example demonstrates that belief, while deeply personal, is profoundly social, dependent on law, consensus, and survival, as much as on doctrine or faith. And so, as Icelanders live out their new lives under the Christian banner, you are left with a reflective thought. When conversion is managed with patience, pragmatism, and respect for local customs, can faith feel fully authentic, or is it always partly a product of necessity and compromise? Story 5. Norway's violent conversion. In Norway, conversion takes a far different path than in Iceland. Here, the land is rugged, fjords carve deep into the mountains, and communities are scattered. Authority is more centralized than in Iceland, but fragile in other ways. Kings rise and fall through battles, alliances, and sheer force of will. In this environment, religion becomes inseparable from power. You first notice the change not in churches, but in the kings themselves. Leaders like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson understand that the old gods, while respected, do not unify the kingdom in the way a single faith can. Paganism is diverse, decentralized, and adaptable. Christianity, by contrast, offers a tool for consolidating authority. It comes with a moral framework, a system of law, and the blessing of foreign rulers whose support can be politically invaluable. The process begins with persuasion, though persuasion in this context is often a thin veil. Kings encourage baptism, invite missionaries, and demonstrate their own devotion. They hold feasts where Christian rituals are performed alongside traditional gatherings. But the underlying message is clear. Alignment with the king now requires alignment with his faith. Resistance is immediate. Many chieftains, deeply tied to ancestral gods, refuse conversion. They see Christianity as a threat to local autonomy, a foreign intrusion into customs that have guided survival for generations. In response, kings escalate. Olaf Tryggvason, in particular, is famous or infamous for enforcing baptism at swordpoint. Refusal is interpreted not merely as disbelief, but as political defiance. Violence is not indiscriminate. Kings often target influential figures first, making examples of those who resist. You see temples burned, sacred groves cut, and sacrifices forbidden. Communities that comply are spared, those that do not face fines, exile, or death. Christianity becomes a tool of political consolidation as much as a spiritual mandate. Daily life transforms rapidly. Pagan rituals disappear from public spaces. Churches are constructed near centers of power, signaling that the king's authority is inseparable from his faith. Clergy gain unprecedented influence, advising rulers, enforcing law, and legitimizing punishments. Ordinary people adapt to survive. Sacrifices are abandoned, and the public calendar shifts to reflect Christian observances. The psychological impact is profound. Faith ceases to be a personal or communal choice. It becomes a matter of safety and loyalty. You practice Christianity, whether or not you understand it fully, because refusal can mean loss of status, property, or life. Belief is enforced externally, and inner conviction often lags behind outward compliance. Yet even amid this violence, old customs linger privately. People continue to tell stories of Thor and Odin in hushed tones. Household charms are kept hidden. Seasonal habits persist, quietly reshaped to avoid confrontation. Conversion is uneven, a patchwork of compliance, adaptation, and secrecy. Kings recognize that conversion must be total to serve its political purpose. Public compliance without private change is insufficient. Rebellions flare when enforcement lapses, reminding rulers that authority in Norway depends on both fear and respect. Missionaries, royal agents, and soldiers work together to cement Christianity as the dominant framework. By the end of this period, Norway's landscape bears the marks of dramatic change. Churches dominate former sacred sites, legal codes reflect Christian norms, and kings assert their authority with the implicit threat of divine sanction. The old gods retreat, but their memory survives in stories, place names, and cultural echoes. And yet, even amid conquest and coercion, a lingering question emerges. When belief is imposed through fear and authority, can it ever be internalized genuinely, or does it survive only as obedience? As Norway's kings consolidate power through Christianity, the practical realities of life shape how faith is experienced. You notice quickly that enforcement is uneven. In remote valleys and rugged fjords, old gods persist quietly in homes and hidden shrines. Families make small, private gestures, pouring a libation on the ground, whispering a prayer to Thor while publicly attending church and participating in Christian rituals. Survival demands this duality. Missionaries and clerics become powerful agents of the crown. They teach reading and writing, administer law, and oversee the collection of tithes. Literacy and record-keeping create a new layer of authority. A king's command is reinforced not only by sword and reputation, but by written law interpreted and enforced by clergy. Christianity, in this sense, becomes inseparable from governance. Resistance persists, but it is increasingly risky. Local chieftains who resist are isolated, sometimes exiled, sometimes executed. Villages that cling openly to old rituals may face collective punishment. The climate of fear ensures outward compliance, but inward belief evolves slowly. For many, Christianity is learned behavior first, conviction later if ever. At the household level, adaptation is subtle. Pagan festivals are replaced by Christian observances, yet their timing often mirrors the old seasonal rhythms. Yule becomes Christmas. Spring fertility rituals are folded into Easter celebrations. In this way, the new faith overlays the old culture rather than eliminating it entirely. People continue to honor ancestors, though the forms of remembrance shift. The coercive conversion also accelerates political centralization. Kings gain control over territories previously bound only by personal loyalty. Christianity provides a shared framework for resolving disputes across regions, reducing the autonomy of local chieftains. Law becomes standardized, succession more predictable, and alliances more durable. Faith and power are intertwined. To oppose the king is now a potential act of heresy as well as rebellion. You observe, too, the psychological consequences. Fear drives participation initially, but over generations, habit solidifies belief. Children baptized under royal authority grow up learning Christian prayers, attending church, and observing holy days as routine. Compliance becomes routine, and routine eventually hardens into cultural norm. The once foreign God gradually becomes familiar, even intimate. Yet the process is never total. Folk memory preserves old gods in stories, runes, and proverbs. Thor's hammer remains a symbol of protection in amulets, even as crosses are worn openly. People continue to navigate between two worlds, blending outward obedience with private tradition. Coercion succeeds in creating public uniformity, but it cannot erase personal memory. The kings recognize this limitation. They know that internal conviction is desirable but not essential to maintaining order. Faith, in Norway, becomes both law and identity, less personal and more structural. Compliance shapes culture more effectively than argument. Missionaries and rulers work together to ensure that the public practice of Christianity dominates, creating the appearance of uniform belief even where the private heart remains divided. By the end of this period, Norway is fundamentally transformed. The landscape, society, and governance are reshaped around the new faith. Pagan practice persists only in quiet, hidden spaces. Christianity asserts dominance through a combination of authority, law, and social pressure, creating a unified cultural framework where none existed before. And as the transformation settles, a pressing question remains. When faith spreads through coercion and political necessity rather than choice, can it survive the generations that follow as genuine belief, or does it risk fading once fear and enforcement are gone? By the early 11th century, the landscape of Norway has been fundamentally altered. Pagan temples are gone or repurposed. Sacred groves, once carefully preserved by local communities, are felled or forgotten. The rhythm of public life festivals, assemblies, marriages, and burials is now oriented around Christian observances. For you, it is evident that the transformation is complete outwardly, even if inward belief lags behind. The king's strategy of coercion has achieved its primary goal: unity. The kingdom is more centralized, disputes are resolved under Christian law, and rulers can claim divine sanction for their authority. Missionaries and clerics enforce obedience, teach literacy, and maintain records, embedding Christianity not just spiritually, but administratively. The faith is now inseparable from governance. Yet Norway's conversion leaves enduring tensions. Private adherence to old gods, though diminished, continues quietly. Amulets, charms, and whispered prayers survive in rural valleys. Folktales preserve the exploits of Thor and Odin, often adapted into moral or cultural lessons. The gods no longer intervene in daily affairs, but memory keeps them alive, coloring behavior, thought, and identity. Over generations, coercion becomes habit. Children baptized under royal authority grow into adults for whom Christian practices are normal. Public compliance becomes private habit, and eventually, habit can resemble belief. Fear gives way to routine, and routine can slowly nurture faith. But whether this faith is fully internalized or merely functional remains ambiguous. Christianity in Norway has become both cultural glue and moral framework, binding society together while still carrying the echoes of its violent imposition. The kings understand the delicate balance. Enforcement secures order, but lasting faith requires continuity, ritual, and education. Churches and clergy proliferate, ensuring that each generation encounters the faith early and regularly. Over time, obedience and belief begin to align. Christianity survives because it adapts to human needs for structure, stability, and meaning, even when its initial spread was enforced. You notice that the old gods have not disappeared entirely. They have been absorbed, marginalized, or transformed. Thor survives in metaphor, Odin in storytelling, and the rhythms of nature. Harsh winters, storms, and volcanic eruptions still evoke respect and caution reminiscent of pagan understanding. In a sense, the Viking worldview never fully dies. It is overlaid with new structures, reshaped by law and faith, yet subtly enduring in culture. By the end, Norway's violent conversion demonstrates a stark truth. Faith imposed by force can succeed, but its endurance depends on habit, social structures, and generational transmission. Authority ensures compliance in the short term, but culture determines whether belief survives the long term. Christianity in Norway becomes both a religion and a tool, a moral and political framework that redefines society from top to bottom. And so, as you look at the transformed Norwegian fjords, you are left with a final, reflective question. When belief is shaped primarily by fear and obligation, can it ever feel like something freely chosen, or does it remain, in some sense, borrowed from power itself? Story 6. Denmark and the slow work of stone churches. In Denmark, the conversion to Christianity follows a path somewhere between Norway's forceful enforcement and Iceland's careful compromise. The land is flatter, more accessible, and densely settled, which makes both communication and control easier, but it also makes dissent more visible. Authority rests partly with kings, partly with regional lords, and partly with the church, which is gradually establishing its physical presence. You notice first the buildings. Early churches in Denmark are simple timber structures, hastily erected near settlements or trading centers. They are small, functional, and modest, yet their placement is deliberate, near rivers, roads, and the halls of local chieftains. These buildings are more than places of worship, they are symbols. They declare a new order, visible markers of a faith that demands attention. Clergy travel from abroad at first, often bringing literacy, Christian law, and exotic practices unfamiliar to the local population. Their presence is unusual and sometimes unsettling. You hear Latin prayers, see unfamiliar vestments, and witness rituals whose meaning is not immediately clear. Yet these strangers also offer advantages: written contracts, diplomatic connections, and links to kings and bishops beyond Denmark. Aligning with them becomes both a religious and a practical choice. Early converts are often elite, as in Norway. Kings and powerful lords adopt baptism, creating pressure for their subjects to follow. Baptism is public and ceremonial, and sometimes accompanied by feasts, oaths of loyalty, or even threats of punishment for noncompliance. The symbolism is deliberate. To reject Christianity is to reject authority itself. Compliance is often practical, even when conviction is absent. The process is gradual. Timber churches are replaced by stone over decades, a signal of permanence. Stone requires labor, organization, and resources, symbolic investment in a faith that is becoming an institution. As these churches rise, so too does the administrative presence of the church. Clergy become record keepers, advisors, and arbiters of law. Christian authority becomes embedded in the landscape and the social fabric. For ordinary people, life changes slowly. Pagan practices continue in homes and fields. Rituals are often folded into Christian observances rather than eliminated entirely. Seasonal festivals are adapted, not abolished. Yule becomes Christmas. Harvest feasts align with saints' days. Over time, these overlays shift perception. Old practices are reinterpreted as tradition. New practices become routine, and Christianity's dominance grows quietly. Resistance is possible but limited. Denmark's landscape and social structure allow kings and church officials to monitor and influence compliance more effectively than in Iceland or rural Norway. Feuds, sacrifices, and hidden worship continue, but more discreetly. Open defiance is risky, and gradual enforcement ensures that compliance, habit, and eventually belief expand together. Trade also accelerates conversion. Merchants traveling to Christian lands, England, France, or beyond encounter markets, customs, and rules tied to Christian law. Practicality encourages participation. A baptized trader has access to wider networks. A Christian king can negotiate alliances that a pagan lord cannot. Christianity spreads not only by ritual or decree, but by the quiet force of economic integration. By the early 11th century, stone churches dominate Denmark's major centers, signaling both permanence and cultural change. Faith is no longer just a foreign novelty or elite preference, it is woven into the identity of towns, kingships, and regional governance. The landscape itself reflects the slow work of conversion: timber to stone, private practice to public institution, ritual to law. Yet the process is incomplete. You can still find traces of pagan memory in local stories, superstitions, and rural customs. Christianity overlays the old culture rather than erasing it entirely, shaping both life and landscape without fully eradicating the past. And so, as you walk among these emerging stone churches, a question persists. When faith spreads through infrastructure, law, and economy as much as belief, does it ever truly belong to the people, or does it remain a framework imposed by the world around them? As decades pass, Christianity in Denmark begins to embed itself more deeply not just in law and kingship, but in the daily rhythms of ordinary life. You notice that the stone churches, once novelties, become central to community identity. Villages gather there not only for worship but for assemblies, markets, and social interaction. The church becomes both spiritual and civic center, reinforcing the authority of kings and clergy alike. Missionaries and clergy work patiently. They observe, instruct, and advise rather than immediately demand full conversion from every household. Teaching is incremental: baptism first, followed by instruction in prayers and festivals, and eventually participation in Christian law and ritual. For many, Christianity is learned behavior initially, habit before conviction. Yet resistance persists. Rural communities far from royal oversight maintain older rituals privately. Seasonal festivals retain echoes of ancestral gods, charms are hidden in homes, and stories of Thor and Odin are told to children. Even as stone churches dominate the landscape, these private acts persist. Christianity overlays the culture, but it does not instantly erase memory. Kings, aware of these challenges, enforce compliance strategically. Public pagan rituals are outlawed. Chieftains who resist baptism or hinder Christian law are pressured through fines, exile, or military intervention. Yet coercion is measured. The goal is not mass extermination, but alignment. Authority ensures that noncompliance carries social and economic consequences. Trade continues to accelerate change. Denmark's position as a crossroads of commerce connects it to England, France, and other Christian regions. Merchants who refuse baptism find their networks limited. Christian law standardizes contracts, inheritance, and dispute resolution. Compliance with Christianity becomes as much practical as spiritual. Over time, habit transforms into identity. Children raised with Christian education, liturgy, and calendar rarely know a pagan alternative beyond stories. Rituals once necessary for survival become symbolic. Feasts and holy days retain structure but are reinterpreted through Christian frameworks. Memory preserves elements of the old culture, but in public life, Christianity dominates. Clergy themselves adapt. They integrate local customs where possible to ease transition. Certain festivals are tolerated in form if stripped of ritual meaning. Saints absorb characteristics of former gods. Cultural memory persists, but its power diminishes as the church grows stronger. By the mid-11th century, the transformation is visible everywhere. Stone churches dominate settlements, clergy advise kings, and law is increasingly framed in Christian terms. Paganism survives only in hidden practices, local memory, and folklore. Faith has become a tool for governance, social cohesion, and economic integration, not only a spiritual practice. Yet the question remains subtle but persistent. When religion spreads through social, economic, and political structures rather than through personal choice, can it ever fully resonate as belief, or is it always partially obedience to circumstance? By the early 12th century, Denmark has been reshaped by Christianity almost entirely. Stone churches rise across towns and villages, replacing earlier timber structures and dominating the landscape. Clergy are established in every major settlement, advising kings, resolving disputes, and maintaining records. The faith is no longer just a novelty, it is integral to governance, law, and daily life. For ordinary people, life feels both familiar and transformed. Seasonal cycles remain, but they are now framed by Christian holy days. Yule becomes Christmas, spring feasts align with Easter, and harvest festivals incorporate prayers and rituals sanctioned by the church. Old practices are remembered, sometimes adapted, sometimes quietly forgotten. Pagan memory survives in folklore, place names, and stories, but the practical and legal structures of daily life are thoroughly Christian. Trade and travel reinforce this shift. A Danish trader sailing to England, Francia, or Norway finds that baptism and Christian law facilitate commerce, diplomacy, and alliances. Participation in the wider Christian world becomes a practical necessity as much as a spiritual practice. Religion has moved from belief to infrastructure and organizing principle of society. Yet beneath the public structure, memory and culture preserve traces of the past. You notice hidden charms, folk tales, and old festivals adapted into Christian contexts. The hammer of Thor survives as a symbol, Odin as a moral figure in stories, but the gods no longer intervene in daily affairs. Christianity dominates, but it has absorbed and reshaped what it replaced rather than completely erasing it. The slow, structural approach to conversion in Denmark contrasts sharply with the violent enforcement seen in Norway or the negotiated compromise of Iceland. Here, faith spreads gradually through habit, law, architecture, and economy. Over generations, practice becomes routine, habit becomes identity, and identity becomes belief, though often layered with echoes of the old culture. Kings, chieftains, and clergy all play roles in this transformation, but ordinary people adapt in ways both subtle and enduring. The Danish experience demonstrates that religion can succeed less through force or compromise, and more through the slow, steady establishment of institutions and social expectation. Stone replaces wood, law replaces ritual, and community structures embed belief in everyday life. And so, as you walk among the stone churches, you see both permanence and memory, a culture thoroughly Christian, yet quietly shaped by what came before. The lingering question remains: when faith grows through structure, law, and habit rather than personal conviction, is it truly embraced, or is it, in some sense, always inherited from the world around you? Story 7. Sweden's fragmented conversion. Sweden in the Viking Age is a patchwork of regions, each ruled by its own king or chieftain. Authority is uneven, shifting, and heavily localized. Unlike Norway, where kings could exert centralized force, or Denmark, where churches gradually solidified through institutions, Sweden is fragmented. Power is distributed across forests, rivers, and distant settlements, making enforcement of any law religious or secular challenging. You notice first that the landscape itself shapes belief. Sacred groves and burial mounds dot the countryside. Streams, rocks, and hills carry the presence of local gods, and rituals are tied intimately to specific places. Unlike in Iceland, where rituals were adaptable and mobile, or Denmark, where stone churches slowly replaced timber structures, in Sweden religion is deeply rooted in the land. Paganism here is not just a practice. It is a network woven into survival, memory, and identity. Christianity arrives in small doses. Missionaries from the south, traders with connections abroad, and returning exiles who have been baptized. Their presence is uneven. Some regions are visited repeatedly, others see them once and never again. Their message is clear: one God, one faith, but practical enforcement is limited. They rely on persuasion, prestige, and political alliances, not armies or royal decrees. Local chieftains react differently. Some are curious, especially those with ambitions for trade, travel, or alliances beyond their borders. Baptism offers prestige, legitimacy, and access to the growing Christian network across Europe. Others resist openly, fearing loss of autonomy and the alien nature of the new religion. For ordinary people, these competing influences create a landscape of choice, tension, and uncertainty. Conversion is slow and fragmented. In some areas, kings adopt Christianity fully, while subjects blend old and new practices. In other regions, paganism remains dominant, with rituals, sacrifices, and sacred sites actively maintained. Even within single communities, belief can be divided. One household may attend Christian services while neighbors quietly honor Thor or Freya. The patchwork of faith is both practical and symbolic. Missionaries adapt to this reality. They target elites first, hoping that influence will trickle down. They emphasize moral and social benefits, justice, order, and alliances with distant rulers. They teach reading, Latin prayers, and customs that connect the Swedish regions to Christian Europe. But conversion is tentative, often partial, and sometimes reversible. A king may embrace Christianity for a decade, then revert under pressure from rival lords or persistent pagan traditions. Trade and foreign relations further complicate matters. Christian networks in Germany, England, and the Baltic encourage adoption for practical reasons, but pagan customs persist at home. Wealth, diplomacy, and survival intersect with belief, creating a hybrid culture that is neither fully Christian nor entirely pagan. Faith in Sweden is thus lived as negotiation and adaptation, not simple acceptance. By the late 10th century, it becomes clear that Sweden's conversion will not resemble Norway's enforced compliance, Denmark's slow institutional overlay, or Iceland's negotiated compromise. Instead, it will be a fragmented, uneven process shaped by geography, politics, and local culture. The old gods remain present not only in memory but in daily life, tethered to land, ritual, and social identity. And so you are left with a quiet question that hangs over Sweden's forests and rivers. In a land where belief is fragmented and authority decentralized, can Christianity ever unify the people? Or will it always exist as one faith among many, coexisting uneasily with what came before? In Sweden, the spread of Christianity is less a wave than a series of small, irregular currents, moving at different speeds through different regions. You notice that some areas, especially those near trade routes and towns connected to Christian Europe, experience change more quickly. Merchants and local chieftains adopt baptism to facilitate commerce and alliances, blending practical advantage with emerging faith. The church gains a foothold here, though often tenuously, through the cooperation of elites rather than the consent of entire communities. Further inland, however, the forests, lakes, and mountains form natural barriers. Here, old beliefs persist. Sacred groves continue to host rituals, burial mounds remain revered, and sacrifices are offered to Thor, Freya, or local spirits. Christianity is present only occasionally. A traveling missionary, a baptized noble, or a returning trader may introduce new ideas, but enforcement is weak. In these regions, pagan practice is not secret, it is survival. Religion is tied to agriculture, hunting, and understanding the rhythms of nature. Local rulers adopt different strategies. Some embrace Christianity enthusiastically, seeking prestige and legitimacy among foreign kings. Others adopt it formally for convenience, participating in baptism and church ceremonies, but continuing pagan practices privately or tolerating them among their subjects. The result is a patchwork of belief, visible in everything from law to ritual observance. The patchwork extends even within families. You may attend a Christian service on Sunday, participate in holy feasts, and observe church law, yet at home maintain charms, seasonal rituals, and private prayers to old gods. Children learn both sets of customs, creating a hybrid cultural identity. Faith in Sweden is as much about negotiation and adaptation as devotion. Missionaries adapt their message to local conditions. They emphasize moral guidance, community cohesion, and practical benefits rather than demanding immediate renunciation of old practices. They cultivate relationships with chieftains, offering education, legal knowledge, and connections abroad. This slow, persistent approach increases acceptance without provoking violent resistance. Still, conversion is uneven, and it can stall or even reverse if political or environmental pressures favor pagan traditions. Trade and external pressures accelerate the spread of Christianity in coastal regions. Connections to the Christian world, Germany, England, and the Baltic encourage baptism and church building, offering tangible benefits in terms of trade, alliances, and influence. Inland areas, isolated from these networks, remain largely pagan. The result is a Sweden divided not only geographically but culturally, with faith as a marker of both political affiliation and access to opportunity. By the early 11th century, Sweden's Christian landscape is fragmented but growing. Some areas have established churches and regular clerical presence. Others maintain old practices, quietly integrated into everyday life. Christianity exists as an overlay, publicly visible and institutionally supported, yet coexisting with older rituals and memory. And so the question persists. In a land where faith is irregular, authority is dispersed, and memory is deeply rooted, can Christianity ever unify Sweden completely, or will it remain a mosaic of belief, endlessly negotiated and fragile in practice? By the mid-11th century, Sweden presents a strikingly uneven religious landscape. In some regions, Christian kings, churches, and clergy dominate public life. Laws are framed according to Christian principles, marriages and burials follow the church's guidance, and communities participate in holy feasts. Christianity here is outwardly comprehensive, appearing as the dominant framework of society. Yet inland, in forests, valleys, and remote settlements, pagan practices continue to thrive. Sacred groves are tended quietly, seasonal sacrifices persist in hidden locations, and stories of Thor, Odin, and Freya are told as moral lessons or cautionary tales. Religion is intimately tied to the land. The gods are present where the people live, hunt, farm, and navigate natural hazards. The faith of Sweden is a mosaic: institutional Christianity in some areas, resilient paganism in others, and a blended, hybrid practice in between. Ordinary people adapt pragmatically. Compliance with Christian law ensures access to trade, protection under the king, and social legitimacy. At the same time, private rituals preserve memory, honor ancestors, and maintain a connection to older ways. Children grow up bilingual in belief, learning Christian prayers and church customs, yet understanding the old gods as part of cultural heritage. Conversion is a process measured in generations, not years. Kings and chieftains play critical roles, but authority is never absolute. Fragmentation limits coercion. Enforcement relies on negotiation, prestige, and alliances. Missionaries focus on coastal trade hubs and politically strategic regions, leaving interior areas largely untouched. Christianity's growth is therefore irregular, contingent on geography, politics, and social networks. The cultural effect is profound. Sweden's identity becomes layered. Christianity structures governance, law, and public observance, while memory of the old gods informs storytelling, place names, and folklore. Ritual, belief, and law coexist uneasily, creating a society in which faith is negotiated daily rather than imposed universally. Looking across Sweden, you realize the enduring lesson. Conversion is not always linear or uniform. Geography, politics, culture, and personal pragmatism shape the adoption of faith. Christianity succeeds institutionally, yet it accommodates, absorbs, and adapts to the existing cultural fabric rather than completely erasing it. The old and new gods coexist not in harmony, but in tension, memory, and adaptation. And so, as you walk along the Swedish rivers and through the forests, a final question remains. When belief spreads unevenly and authority is dispersed, can faith ever become truly unified, or does it remain an intricate mosaic, constantly negotiated and preserved by both memory and necessity? Story 8. The role of women in conversion. You may not immediately notice the role of women in the Viking Age, because most chronicles focus on kings, warriors, and missionaries. Yet in the slow, uneven process of conversion, women are central. They carry faith into homes, influence marriages, shape daily routines, and act as intermediaries between generations. In many cases, Christianity spreads not by sword or law, but through the quiet agency of mothers and wives. In daily life, women manage households, farms, and the education of children. They control food preparation, family rituals, and the transmission of seasonal knowledge. Pagan customs, sacrifices, offerings, and seasonal festivals are often organized or overseen by women. When Christianity arrives, these domestic roles become conduits for religious change. A mother baptized abroad may introduce prayer to her children, teach Christian songs, or subtly alter the timing and significance of household celebrations. Marriage becomes another vector for faith. Intermarriage between Christian and pagan families introduces negotiation at the most intimate level. A Christian bride may bring baptismal practice into a pagan household. A Christian wife may insist on Christian burial for her children. Sometimes these interventions are subtle, sometimes overt, and they shape the cultural fabric across generations. In a society without universal law enforcement, influence within the household is often more powerful than external pressure. Women also serve as cultural intermediaries. Missionaries, especially early ones traveling from abroad, often rely on the goodwill of women to understand local customs, secure hospitality, and gain access to communities. Women control the rhythms of daily life that make rituals possible. They know when the community gathers, when food is stored, and how seasonal practices function. Convincing women to adopt Christian practices can therefore accelerate broader conversion. The impact extends to symbolic and ritual space as well. Women participate in the preparation of feast days, in prayers for household safety, and in rites of passage. By embracing Christian norms, women gradually shape the moral and spiritual education of children. Over time, the domestic sphere becomes a microcosm of the larger religious transformation occurring in the public sphere. The home mirrors the church. Yet this influence is neither uniform nor unchallenged. In households where women adopt Christianity but male heads remain pagan, tension arises. Rituals may conflict. Seasonal celebrations may be negotiated. Children are caught between competing traditions. In these cases, women exercise subtle negotiation rather than open confrontation, adapting their influence to ensure family cohesion while still transmitting new practices. Beyond the household, women also preserve memory. As Christianity spreads through law, kings, and public observance, older rituals and stories survive in women's storytelling, songs, and practical guidance. Women's transmission of cultural memory ensures that pagan belief does not disappear entirely, even as Christian practices become dominant in public life. They are both agents of change and custodians of the past. The Viking world, from this perspective, is a network of domestic and social influence. Conversion is not simply imposed by kings or missionaries. It travels through households, marriages, and female agency. Women shape faith quietly but decisively, aligning domestic life with new norms while preserving continuity with the old. And so, as you trace the threads of daily life in Viking homes, A question emerges. If conversion often spreads through the quiet influence of women rather than the force of kings, does this change our understanding of how faith truly takes root in society, or whose story is most important in shaping history? As Christianity spreads, the role of women becomes even more visible but in subtle, often indirect ways. You notice that the domestic sphere, far from being passive, is a primary arena for the negotiation of faith. Women shape not only household rituals but also social cohesion, education, and long-term cultural memory. Their influence operates quietly, yet decisively, in communities large and small. In many Viking households, women negotiate between competing traditions. A Christian wife may encourage baptism and prayers, while her husband participates in pagan sacrifices. Children learn both sets of rituals, blending old and new in ways that preserve social harmony. Women's agency in these moments is not overtly political, but it is essential. Households function as microcosms of the broader cultural negotiation occurring in kingdoms and villages. Women also facilitate practical adaptations of Christianity. They adjust feasts, align seasonal work with church calendars, and incorporate Christian blessings into domestic life. For instance, a woman overseeing harvests might recite a Christian prayer while performing tasks previously accompanied by pagan rituals. These adaptations ease tension, allowing communities to adopt Christian practices without abandoning local identity or survival strategies. Christianity, in this way, spreads more effectively through flexibility and household mediation than through enforcement alone. Mothers and grandmothers play a particularly critical role in transmitting faith to children. Literacy and formal education are rare in early Viking societies, but oral instruction, storytelling, and ritual practice are constant. Christian prayers, hymns, and stories are taught alongside practical knowledge of seasons, farming, and family duties. Faith becomes inseparable from daily life and survival, carried first by those responsible for the rhythm of the household. Women also influence broader cultural change through social networks. Hospitality, alliances through marriage, and family connections make them conduits for ideas and practices. A Christian woman married into a pagan household may extend influence beyond her own family, impacting neighbors, kin, and local traditions. Through these networks, Christianity spreads horizontally as much as vertically, moving across communities without coercion. Yet women also act as custodians of memory. They preserve stories, charms, and knowledge of old rituals even as public practice shifts toward Christianity. In doing so, they maintain continuity with the past, embedding the old beliefs into a layered cultural identity. This dual role as agents of conversion and preservers of tradition shapes the character of faith for generations. Christianity in Viking societies does not entirely erase paganism. It overlays it, and women ensure that traces endure. Political and social pressures often amplify women's influence. In households where men are compelled to adopt Christianity for political reasons, women's choices determine how faith is lived daily. Rituals, childcare, food preparation, and family celebrations all become opportunities for shaping religious life. Compliance at the household level becomes the foundation for long-term cultural transformation. And so, as you observe the quiet power wielded in homes across the Viking world, one reflection emerges. While kings and missionaries often receive credit for conversion, it is women, the mothers, wives, and domestic leaders who anchor faith in daily life, ensuring that belief survives not by force, but through sustained, lived experience. The question lingers: if faith spreads most effectively through domestic and social influence rather than coercion, what does this tell us about the true drivers of historical change and the people whose roles are most easily overlooked? By the early 12th century, the work of women in the Viking world has left an enduring mark on the landscape of faith. Christianity is now dominant in most communities, but it is deeply intertwined with domestic life, social networks, and cultural memory. You notice that while kings and missionaries introduced the faith, women ensured its survival, adaptation, and meaningful integration into everyday life. Households function as centers of religious continuity. Mothers and wives oversee daily rituals, prayers before meals, blessings for children, and celebrations of holy days. These practices transform routine survival tasks into moments of faith, embedding Christian belief into the fabric of domestic existence. Children grow up fluent in prayer, ritual, and moral teaching, not merely because of formal instruction, but because faith is modeled in daily life. Christianity becomes habitual, inseparable from family structure, and ultimately internalized. Women's role in memory preservation is equally significant. Even as churches rise and public rituals dominate, domestic storytelling preserves pagan narratives, seasonal lore, and ancestral customs. These stories are rarely framed as opposition to Christianity. Instead, they are adapted, moralized, or reinterpreted to coexist with Christian belief. The old gods survive in narrative, symbolism, and cultural reference, ensuring continuity even amid transformation. Marriage networks amplify women's influence. A Christian woman marrying into a household or region with differing practices often becomes the mediator, aligning domestic life with new norms while respecting local identity. Over generations, these choices accumulate, creating communities whose faith reflects both inheritance and negotiation. Christianity spreads organically, rooted not in force but in the rhythms of family life, social bonds, and generational teaching. Women also shape broader society indirectly through economic and social agency. They control food, labor, and hospitality, critical resources in a subsistence-based society. Participation in feasts, festivals, and religious observances under their management reinforces Christian practice across extended families and neighbors. Even in regions where political authority is distant or fragmented, women anchor faith in the practical realities of daily survival. The cumulative effect is profound. Christianity becomes culturally resilient, not because it is imposed, but because it is lived, taught, and transmitted. Kings and clerics provide authority and structure, but the enduring strength of faith rests in the quiet work of households, where women ensure that belief is habitual, meaningful, and generationally transmitted. Yet this legacy is complex. Christianity in Viking society is layered. Public rituals, written law, and kings. Authority overlay domestic practices and memory. Faith is intertwined with obedience, habit, and social expectation. The stories, customs, and practices preserved by women ensure that the old culture is never fully erased, creating a nuanced, hybrid religious identity. And so, as you reflect on the Viking world, one enduring thought remains. If the survival and transformation of belief rely as much on the daily influence of women as on kings, missionaries, or battles, then understanding history requires attention to those whose work is quiet, persistent, and deeply human. Conversion is not only a matter of law or power, it is a domestic, lived experience that shapes the soul of a society.